By 1968, the most powerful automobile industry in the world had one rule it had never been forced to question. Bigger was better. Not because anyone had studied the science of desire, not because research had proven it, but because the formula had worked for decades. And in America, things that work for a long time begin to feel like laws of nature. Detroit built large cars because Americans bought large cars. Americans bought large cars because that was what Detroit built. The loop was closed. The logic was circular. And for a long time, it seemed unbreakable. Into that world in 1968 arrived a compact Japanese sedan that almost nobody in the American automotive press took seriously. The New York Times noted its arrival in a headline that captured the general attitude of the moment. Corolla, new economy car, is shown here by Toyota. Not a story, a note, a curiosity, a small, underpowered foreign vehicle priced at $1,700, arriving in a country where gasoline costs 35 cents per gallon, and nobody was asking for less car. What happened next took 29 years to complete, but by 1997, the Toyota Corolla had become the best-selling automobile nameplate in human history, passing the Volkswagen Beetle, a car that had already become a legend, with over 50 million units sold across 150 countries by the time you are watching this. One Corolla has been sold on average every 40 seconds, continuously, for more than half a century. And here's the part almost nobody expected. None of it was supposed to happen in America. The Corolla was not designed for American roads. It was not engineered for American tastes. It was not built to defeat Detroit. It was built to solve a problem in Japan that most Americans had never heard of. And it solved that problem so well that it accidentally became ready for a crisis no one could predict. This is not a story about a great car. It is the story of what happens when the right machine exists at the exact moment history needs it. If a subscription helps this channel grow, and most of you are watching on a TV, so if someone nearby has a phone or can share this, it makes a real difference. Every subscriber and share gets these stories in front of more people who would genuinely enjoy them. To understand why the Corolla had to be built, you have to go back to Japan in the late 1950s. Not the Japan the world knows today, but a country still visibly rebuilding from a war it had lost less than 15 years earlier. Tokyo in 1955 was a city of motion without horsepower. Millions of people traveled on foot, on bicycle, on crowded trains, on motorcycles and scooters that buzzed through narrow streets in clouds of exhaust. The idea that a working family might own a private car was not aspirational. It was nearly absurd. Personal car ownership accounted for roughly 14% of the Japanese market in 1962. The overwhelming majority of vehicles on the road were commercial trucks, company cars, taxis. Private automobiles were for executives and the wealthy. For everyone else, the car was something you saw through a window. The Japanese government saw this clearly and wanted to change it. In the late 1950s, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, better known as MITI, announced a concept it called the national car. The idea was straightforward. Japan needed an automobile that ordinary families could afford, a vehicle that would bring private car ownership within the reach of the people who were now driving Japan's rapid post-war economic recovery, but who had not yet been invited to enjoy its fruits. Toyota responded with the Publica. Launched in 1961 at 389,000 yen, the Publica was cheap, simple, and utilitarian. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, precisely what the government had asked for. It was also a commercial disappointment. Japanese consumers wanted what the government had correctly identified they needed: affordable mobility. But they wanted something more than bare minimum transportation. The Publica felt like a compromise, a correct answer to the wrong question. People looked at it, calculated their savings, and decided to wait. That commercial failure was one of the most useful lessons Toyota ever received. Tatsuo Hasegawa had spent the Second World War designing aircraft. He graduated from the Department of Aeronautics at Tokyo Imperial University in 1939 and joined Tachikawa Aircraft, applying the kind of precision engineering that Japan's wartime industry demanded. When the war ended, that industry did not. It changed addresses. Engineers who had built fighters and bombers found themselves in factories now building motor vehicles. And Hasegawa eventually arrived at Toyota, where he worked on the Publica before being given responsibility for something larger. In 1963, he began developing what would become the Corolla. The question he was trying to answer was not simply, how do we sell more cars? It was something more specific. What does a Japanese family actually want from a vehicle they have never been able to afford before? What does a first-time car owner need? Not what an engineer assumes they need. Not what a government policy document says they should need. What do real people, standing at the threshold of car ownership for the first time in their lives, actually want? Hasegawa's answer became the doctrine that defined the Corolla across every generation that followed it. He called it the 80-point doctrine. The logic was simple and the implications were profound. A car that scores perfectly in one area but fails in another is not a good car for an ordinary family. An engine with extraordinary performance means nothing if the maintenance costs bankrupt the owner. Beautiful design means nothing if the seats are uncomfortable over long distances. Low price means nothing if the car is so unreliable it cannot be trusted. A vehicle designed for real people, Hasegawa argued, had to score at least 80 points out of 100 in every category that mattered. Price, performance, comfort, reliability, economy, build quality. And the goal was never to be perfect at any one thing. The goal was to be genuinely excellent everywhere, without demanding that the customer sacrifice anything fundamental to gain something marginal. This was not an engineering philosophy. It was a philosophy about people. It was also a quiet revolution in how automobiles were thought about. The Publica had tried to be the cheapest thing possible. Hasegawa understood that cheapness alone was not the point. The point was value. Everything a person needed, nothing they would have to apologize for, delivered at a price that was truly accessible. He wanted a car that its owner would feel proud to own. A car that would not embarrass you on the expressway or make your passengers wish they had taken the train. The Corolla that emerged from this philosophy debuted at the 13th Tokyo Motor Show on October 26, 1966. It was a compact two-door sedan powered by a water-cooled inline-four engine of 1,077 cubic centimeters, carrying, as Toyota would market it, an extra 100C over the rival Datsun Sunny 1000 that had arrived on the market months earlier. That extra engine displacement was a deliberate decision. The Corolla's power advantage over its primary competitor was small, but in a market where performance had suddenly become accessible to people who had never experienced it before, the edge mattered. The car also came equipped with a 4-speed manual transmission at a time when most economy competitors offered 3 speeds. McPherson strut front suspension, advanced technology for the class. Separate front bucket seats instead of a bench. An interior that won contemporary description compared to a living room sofa in the rear. The entire package cost 432,000 yen, and Toyota planned to build 30,000 of them every month. At the time of the launch, Toyota's total monthly production across all vehicles was 50,000 units. Building more than half of everything Toyota made out of one model was either enormous confidence or enormous risk. Within 3 years, the Corolla was Japan's best-selling car. The Tokyo Expressway system was coming together just as the Corolla arrived. The Meishin Expressway linking Nagoya and Osaka had opened in 1965. The Tomei Expressway connecting Nagoya to Tokyo was completed in 1969. The country was building the infrastructure of a motorized society, and the Corolla arrived precisely at the moment when that infrastructure began to make private car ownership genuinely useful for ordinary people. Japanese families discovered something they had not anticipated. A car was not just transportation. It was freedom. It was the ability to take your family somewhere on a Sunday without consulting a train schedule. It was the experience of choosing your own route, your own time, your own destination. Personal car ownership jumped from 14% in 1962 to over 50% by 1970. Japan had entered what observers at the time called the My Car era, the moment when automobiles transformed from symbols of corporate status into possessions of personal identity. The Corolla was at the center of that transformation. By 1968, it had already monopolized the lead position in Japan's economy car market. Sales climbed from 167,000 units in 1968 to 248,000 the following year. For 33 consecutive years, it would remain Japan's top-selling model. Nothing in the country's automotive history came close. But Toyota was watching something more than domestic sales figures. By the late 1960s, Japanese manufacturers had already demonstrated that their vehicles could survive in export markets. The Toyota Corolla was selling in the United States. German manufacturers had established that American consumers would sometimes buy foreign cars for practical reasons. The question was not whether American consumers could be reached. The question was, what kind of American consumer existed that Detroit had not yet served? In 1968, the first Toyota Corolla arrived in the United States. The reception was almost nothing. Gasoline was 35 cents per gallon. Muscle cars were selling in enormous volumes. The Chevrolet Camaro was 2 years old. The Ford Mustang had already established itself as one of the great commercial successes of the decade. American consumers in 1968 were not asking for smaller, slower, more economical transportation. They were asking for horsepower and size, and the feeling that the post-war prosperity their parents had worked for was now fully, tangibly theirs. The Corolla found some traction on the coasts, California, New England, where foreign car culture had taken earlier root. But in America's heartland, it barely registered. At a time when Detroit iron ruled every dealership and no one was worried about fuel costs, a 60-horsepower Japanese compact was not a product solving any problem the American public recognized as urgent. Toyota kept shipping them anyway. This is important, not because the early sales were dramatic, but because Toyota was building something that is harder to measure than quarterly revenue. A presence, a network of dealers, a pool of customers with direct experience of the car's reliability, an American audience that had not been disappointed by what they had purchased. The Corolla's early American sales were small, but the cars that were sold were not failing. They were starting every morning, running every mile, costing less to maintain than their owners had expected. Quietly and without fanfare, Toyota was accumulating the only currency that matters in the long run: trust. Then, in October 1973, a war on the other side of the world changed everything in America's relationship with the automobile. The conflict between Israel and a coalition of Arab states that October triggered an oil embargo by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries against the United States and other nations that had supported Israel. The price of oil had been below $3 a barrel in the early 1970s. Within a year of the embargo, it had quadrupled. By the end of the decade, adjusted for inflation, it would reach nearly 40 times what American consumers had paid at the start of the 1960s. The visual reality of the oil crisis embedded itself in American memory in ways that statistics cannot fully capture. Service stations flying flags when they had fuel and closing when they ran dry. Lines of cars stretching around blocks and down highways, sometimes waiting for hours, odd even rationing in many states, where your license plate's final digit determined which day you were allowed to buy gasoline. The freedom that the automobile had represented, the fundamental American promise of going anywhere, anytime without asking permission, suddenly had a queue attached to it and an uncertain outcome at the front. Detroit's dominant product was a liability. The average American car in 1973 weighed over 4,000 pounds and returned around 12 miles per gallon. The Chevrolet Camaro, the Ford Mustang, the full-size sedans that had defined the industry's commercial peak, all of them consumed fuel at rates that were suddenly terrifying. The Big Three had decades of experience building large, powerful, comfortable automobiles that American consumers had willingly purchased in enormous numbers. What they did not have was a compact, fuel-efficient alternative that American consumers trusted. They built some. The Chevrolet Vega, the Ford Pinto. American compacts rushed to market with haste, and without the accumulated engineering discipline that quality economy cars require. The Vega developed a reputation for corrosion and engine problems. The Pinto became the subject of one of the most damaging safety controversies in American automotive history. Detroit's emergency response to the fuel crisis confirmed, in the minds of many American consumers, something they had not previously been forced to confront. The companies that had spent decades building the world's largest cars were not necessarily equipped to build the world's best small ones. Toyota was already there. The Corolla that had been ignored in America's heartland was suddenly the car that American consumers were looking for. Fuel efficient, reliable, honest, unpretentious. Every Corolla owner who had purchased one between 1968 and 1973 for purely practical reasons became, in the aftermath of the oil crisis, an advertisement that Toyota could not have purchased. The car had simply worked, year after year, requiring less attention and less fuel than anything Detroit was producing. That accumulated reputation, multiplied by the desperation of 1973, transformed the Corolla's American commercial position almost overnight. Toyota dealerships that had struggled to move inventory found customers waiting. The car that had been too small, too foreign, too underpowered for the American market had become, in a single historical moment, exactly the right machine in the right place. Toyota had not been sitting still during those early American years. The second-generation Corolla, introduced in 1970, had grown slightly to address what the company had learned from its first international customers. More interior space, an optional automatic transmission for American commuters who expected it. And in 1971, an upgraded 1.6-liter engine that nearly doubled the original car's power. The engineers had observed what American drivers needed and built it in, not by abandoning the Corolla's fundamental character, but by extending it. The 80-point doctrine had always allowed for targeted improvement above the baseline, and Toyota applied that logic with discipline. By 1974, the Corolla had become the best-selling car in the world. Not in Japan, not in Asia, the world. Within 8 years of its domestic launch, a compact sedan designed to serve Japanese families entering car ownership for the first time had outsold every automobile on Earth. What had happened was not marketing. It was not a clever campaign or a celebrity endorsement or a discount pricing strategy. What had happened was that a car engineered around a genuine understanding of what ordinary people needed had found more ordinary people than anyone had anticipated. The oil crisis was the opening act. The second one, triggered by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, was the confirmation. As prices spiked again, and American consumers re-experienced the shock of fuel dependence, the lesson had to be learned twice before it permanently changed behavior. By 1980, Japanese automakers held 21% of the American market. Toyota was among the most visible beneficiaries. The political fallout in Washington was significant. American automakers and their unions lobbied heavily for protection against Japanese imports. In 1981, the Reagan administration negotiated a voluntary export restraint agreement with Japan, essentially a diplomatic quota that limited how many Japanese cars could be shipped to American shores each year. The restriction was intended to give Detroit breathing room to rebuild its competitive position in the small car segment. It had an unintended consequence that nobody had fully planned for. When Toyota could no longer ship unlimited Corollas to the United States, the car's price rose. As constrained supply with sustained demand always produces, the Corolla became slightly less affordable, and Toyota responded by moving the model upmarket, improving its content and refinement to justify higher price points. What had begun as pure economy transportation began to feel like genuine quality transportation. The embargo designed to slow Toyota's American growth instead forced Toyota to present a more polished, more aspirational version of the very car it had been selling. By the early 1980s, Toyota and the American automobile industry had arrived at something that had not previously existed: a genuine mutual need. The Japanese automaker needed manufacturing presence in the United States to reduce its exposure to trade restrictions and the fluctuations of the yen. American policymakers and industry leaders needed direct access to the production methods that had made Toyota's vehicles so consistently better, in quality and in cost, than anything Detroit was building in the compact segment. In 1984, a former General Motors factory in Fremont, California came back to life. The Fremont plant had been one of GM's worst performers when it closed in 1982. Poor quality, chronic absenteeism, a labor environment that had broken down almost entirely. The cars that had come off its line were symbols of everything that had gone wrong with American manufacturing in the decade prior. GM shut it down and walked away. Toyota agreed to reopen it. The joint venture they created with General Motors, New United Motor Manufacturing, Inc., universally known as NUMMI, was the most significant institutional experiment in American automotive history. Toyota sent engineers and production specialists to Fremont. They brought the Toyota production system, the set of manufacturing principles and practices that had made Toyota's factories among the most efficient and consistently high-quality automobile producers in the world. They applied those principles to the same workers, in the same plant, with the same UAW workforce that GM had determined was incapable of producing quality vehicles. Within a year, the NUMMI plant was among the most productive and highest quality assembly facilities in North America. The car that began rolling off that California production line in December 1984 was, in its first configuration, a version of the Corolla-based Nova 4 Chevrolet, followed later by Toyota versions including the Corolla FX. For the first time, American workers were building a car with a Japanese name. The Corolla had not just conquered the American market as an import. It had become part of American manufacturing itself. The irony was almost too large to hold in a single observation. General Motors, the company whose executives had once watched compact Japanese sedans arrive on American shores with something between amusement and contempt, was now the joint venture partner that had invited Toyota into its own country, to its own factory, to teach its own workers how to build automobiles that Americans would trust. But while the NUMMI story was playing out in Fremont, something else was happening inside the Corolla's identity that nobody had planned and Tatsuo Hasegawa certainly had not designed. The 1983 fifth-generation Corolla had made the switch from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive, dramatically expanding interior space and improving handling efficiency. The decision was driven by the same logic that had always driven Corolla development. What did people actually need? More room, better fuel economy, lower production cost. Front-wheel drive delivered all three. But Toyota maintained one rear-wheel drive Corolla variant. The Corolla Levine and its near twin, the Sprinter Trueno, kept the traditional layout and paired it with a freshly developed 1.6-liter twin-cam engine, producing around 128 horsepower. The model code was AE86. In Japan, it was pronounced Hachiroku 86. The AE86 was not marketed as a sports car. It was not promoted as a performance machine. It was a Corolla variant for customers who preferred rear-wheel drive. But what happened to it after it reached enthusiasts, particularly in Japan, where the disciplines of mountain road racing and the emerging sport of competitive drifting were finding their technical champion, had nothing to do with Toyota's marketing department. The AE86 became a legend built by the people who drove it, not the company that sold it. In the mountain passes of Japan, roads like the Irohazaka driveway in Nikko and Usui Pass in Gunma Prefecture, the lightweight, balanced, tractable little coupe found its calling. Drivers discovered that its combination of a willing engine, a precise gearbox, and rear-wheel drive feedback made it one of the most teachable performance cars ever built. You could feel every consequence of your inputs. You could learn in an AE86 in a way that more powerful, less forgiving cars would not allow. It became the car in which an entire generation of Japanese performance drivers taught themselves. The AE86 also became the primary platform around which competitive drifting, a discipline that would eventually grow into a global motorsport, developed its early culture. Practitioners who would later become internationally recognized drivers spent their formative nights in AE86 on mountain passes, learning the balance between control and the edge of control. None of this was planned. A practical rear-wheel drive Corolla variant had accidentally become the foundation of a global motorsport culture. Back in the mainstream, the Corolla kept doing what it had always done, arriving in new markets, solving new transportation needs, adapting without losing what it fundamentally was. In developing economies, the older generation Corolla found a second life. As newer models arrived in Japan and North America, earlier generations moved into markets across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where their proven reliability and abundant spare parts made them among the most trusted vehicles on roads that punished ordinary cars severely. The Corolla did not conquer these markets with clever advertising. It conquered them by surviving conditions that eliminated less reliable alternatives. A car designed to give Japanese commuters their first reliable personal transportation became, in many parts of the world, the vehicle that governments and NGOs and remote communities trusted to move through terrain where breakdowns were not inconveniences but emergencies. The small Corolla that Hasegawa had designed for suburban Tokyo was running on unpaved roads in countries that Toyota's marketing teams had barely mapped. The same car, an entirely different world. By the mid-1990s, the arithmetic of the Corolla's global sales total was approaching something historic. The Volkswagen Beetle had held the title of best-selling automobile nameplate in the world for decades, a record attached to a car that had itself become one of the most culturally complex machines of the 20th century. As we explored in our earlier episode, the Beetle had sold over 21 million units through a single, largely unchanged design, an achievement that spoke to a kind of obsessive devotion few products in any category have ever inspired. The Corolla had taken a fundamentally different path. Where the Beetle had remained largely static, the Corolla had reinvented itself continuously. 12 generations, each one adapting to what the people of the moment needed. Rear-wheel drive became front-wheel drive. Engine sizes grew and shrank and grew again. Body styles multiplied. Sedan, coupe, hatchback, wagon, and eventually derivatives that barely resembled the original. The Corolla nameplate was never attached to a single machine. It was attached to a philosophy, Hasegawa's 80-point doctrine, applied again and again to whatever the world needed most from an accessible, reliable family car. On January 31st, 1997, Toyota officially certified that the Corolla had surpassed the Volkswagen Beetle as the best-selling automobile nameplate in history. Over 22 million had been sold at the point of passing. The number has not stopped climbing since. By 2021, Toyota had delivered its 50 millionth Corolla. By early 2026, the total had passed 54 million. The record stands uncontested, and no other vehicle is remotely close to challenging it. There is something worth pausing on in the nature of that record. The Corolla is not, and has never been, a car that people describe with passion. It is not the car that appears in cinematic chase sequences or on the cover of enthusiast magazines. Nobody writes essays about the emotional experience of sitting inside a Corolla for the first time. The car has produced exactly one genuine cultural icon, the AE86, which was never sold as an icon. And the rest of its 54 million unit history has been conducted almost entirely below the level of excitement. This is the point. This is the thing Hasegawa understood that the rest of the industry keeps rediscovering. Most people are not buying experiences. They are buying solutions. They need a machine that will carry them and their family from the place they are to the place they need to be, without drama, without expense beyond what they can manage, without requiring more of their attention than a car should require. They need a car that scores 80 points, genuinely 80 points. Not just the pretense of them, across every category that matters to their actual life. They are not enthusiasts. They are not collectors. They are people for whom a car is infrastructure, not identity. The Corolla was designed for those people. It found them in Japan, and then in America, and then in Australia, and across Africa and throughout South America, and in every corner of every continent where ordinary families needed reliable transportation and could not afford to make a mistake in their choice. It found 54 million of them. The NUMMI factory in Fremont, California, closed in April 2010. One of the casualties of General Motors' bankruptcy during the global financial crisis. The last vehicle to move through its production line was a bright red Toyota Corolla. Workers who had spent decades in that factory accompanied it down the final stretch of the assembly line in a procession that more than one of them described as a funeral. The factory was later purchased and became the primary production facility for a different kind of automobile, made by a company building a different kind of future. But that is another story. What matters here is what the NUMMI Corolla represented in that closing moment. A car designed to serve Japanese families in 1966 had been built by American workers in a California factory that America's largest automaker had opened in partnership with Japan's most persistent competitor. The people on that line, UAW members, many of them the children and grandchildren of workers who had built American cars in American factories their entire working lives, had spent years building a machine that Tatsuo Hasegawa had conceived in Toyota City 6 decades earlier. The Corolla had not conquered America the way military campaigns are won, with decisive engagements and clear moments of victory. It had done something quieter and stranger. It had made itself necessary, first to individual families, then to dealerships, then to manufacturers, then to the industrial policy of the country itself, until the boundary between foreign car and American car became genuinely difficult to locate. Today, there are roughly 54 million Corollas in the world, spread across countries whose leaders in 1966 had never heard of Tatsuo Hasegawa, or the Toyota production system, or the Takaoka plant in Toyota City. Some of those cars are on their third or fourth owner. Some are running in markets where the infrastructure of automobile service that makes repair cheap and simple barely exists, kept operational by mechanics who have spent careers learning the particular language of Toyota's engineering. Some are sitting in collections, valued for their historical significance. Some are moving through mountain passes in the hands of drivers continuing a drifting tradition that started on roads in Nikko and Gunma that the original Corolla's engineers never imagined. The car that was supposed to solve Japan's motorization problem is everywhere. It arrived in America as a curiosity. It survived American indifference. It found American customers through a crisis no one had predicted. It built American factories. It outlasted the company that had built those factories alongside it. It did all of this by being, in every generation, 80 points excellent at everything that mattered. Not spectacular. Not transcendent. Not the kind of machine that makes you feel something has changed the moment you sit inside it. Simply, reliably, continuously good. And that turned out to be enough to become the most reproduced automobile in the history of human transportation. There is a lesson somewhere in that, about what people actually need, as opposed to what they say they want, as opposed to what industries spend decades assuming they will accept. But the Corolla has never been the kind of car to announce its lessons. It simply keeps selling quietly, one every 40 seconds, in 150 countries, to the next family that needs a car and cannot afford to make a mistake. The story of the Corolla is in some ways the inverse of the Chevrolet Corvette, a car we explored in our previous episode, where the Corvette was conceived as a dream first and a product second, fighting for its survival against the very executives who created it. The Corolla was conceived as a solution and became something far larger than any dream could have contained. Two philosophies about what an automobile should be. Two very different kinds of immortality. The next time we look at that contrast between machines built to inspire and machines built to serve, we'll find it in places the automotive industry itself didn't expect.